April 1945, Okinawa. Rain hammered the canvas of a U.S. field hospital, blurring the boundary between mud and blood. Inside, the air reeked of iodine, sweat, and fear. The war outside had not stopped. Artillery still echoed through the ridges. Yet, in this small tent, silence reigned. A young American nurse knelt beside a stretcher. The man before her wore the torn khaki of the Imperial Japanese Army. His breathing was shallow, his eyes wide with disbelief. She pressed a bloodied bandage against his side, her hands trembling not from fear, but exhaustion. Around her, wounded Marines groaned, medics shouted for morphine, and generators coughed light into the chaos. Still, she stayed with him. When he tried to push her hand away, murmuring, "Yamete, don't," she whispered, almost to herself. "You're safe now." Those words stunned him more than the pain. He had been taught that capture meant torture. Instead, the enemy was saving his life. Outside, the guns thundered on. Inside, a single act of mercy rewrote everything he had believed about the enemy. In 1942, the Pacific was a vast and merciless ocean of fire. From the beaches of Guadalcanal to the jungles of New Guinea, the war between Japan and the United States had become something more than a clash of armies. It was a collision of worlds. For Imperial Japan, surrender was dishonor. Soldiers were raised to believe death was duty. In the Bushido Code, capture was shameful, a stain that followed the family name for generations. Many Japanese soldiers carried a single bullet for themselves, not for the enemy, but for the moment defeat became certain. The Americans saw this with disbelief. On Guadalcanal, Marines found enemy soldiers charging with bayonets even after being shot multiple times. In Saipan, hundreds of civilians jumped from cliffs rather than be captured. To the men in khaki and olive drab, it felt like facing an army that refused to be human. By 1943, the U.S. military had learned to harden its heart. In training films and briefings, Japanese troops were described as fanatics, not individuals. This language stripped away identity and created distance, the kind that made killing easier. But for the American Medical Corps, that distance was impossible to maintain. Their mission wasn't to kill, it was to preserve life, any life that reached their hands alive. The early years of the Pacific Campaign tested that ideal brutally. Field hospitals were primitive, often just tents in the mud. Supplies ran thin, tropical heat rotted bandages, and infections killed faster than bullets. Medical officers worked under shell fire, amputating by lantern light. Nurses were rare in 1942. Most were still stationed in Hawaii or Australia. The men who carried stretchers, often corpsmen barely out of high school, were the only barrier between a wounded man and death. They were taught the Geneva Convention, to treat the enemy if captured. But few ever expected that moment to come. Japanese soldiers almost never surrendered. Yet slowly, the impossible began to happen. As the tide of war shifted, more wounded Japanese were captured alive. Some were barely breathing, others terrified beyond words. The Americans faced a choice they had been trained for, but not emotionally prepared to make: to help those who had tried to kill them hours earlier. In the sticky heat of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, corpsmen knelt over bleeding men whose uniforms carried the rising sun. They cleaned wounds, gave water, and whispered words the prisoners couldn't understand. And somewhere between the sound of distant gunfire and the stench of infection, the first quiet acts of compassion began to appear. Still, this mercy was not simple. Hatred had roots, deep and raw. Many nurses and medics had lost brothers or friends to the same uniform now lying on their tables. Every bandage tied to a Japanese wound was a small defiance of rage, a refusal to become what the war demanded. The Pacific was unlike Europe. There was no front line, no safety behind the wire. Every island was its own world, and each day, the difference between humanity and vengeance thinned. Yet amid that darkness, the idea of medical neutrality, that life mattered beyond nationality, began to take hold. It was not easy, and it was not common. But in the silence after battle, when cries for help rose from both sides, even hardened soldiers saw that pain spoke no language. By the end of 1943, the medical corps had evolved from improvised units to structured teams with better supplies, clearer ethics, and a growing number of trained nurses ready to serve in forward areas. These women would soon walk into a war zone, unlike any before, where compassion itself became a battlefield. By 1944, the Pacific War had changed. America was no longer fighting for survival. It was advancing island by island, clawing toward Japan itself. The U.S. Navy ruled the seas, but every patch of sand taken came at a cost measured in blood. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Leyte, names that would echo for generations. With each new offensive, the medical corps faced a test of endurance. Hospitals had to move as fast as the front lines. Portable surgical units became lifelines, flown in on C-47 transports or unloaded from landing craft minutes after combat. Doctors and nurses operated in tents that shook from nearby artillery, sterilizing scalpels in buckets of boiled water. The United States Army Nurse Corps and the American Red Cross began sending women closer to combat than ever before. They were trained professionals, most in their 20s, armed with syringes, scissors, and an unspoken courage. Many had volunteered after seeing Pearl Harbor burn. Others had brothers in uniform. All knew they were walking into a kind of hell no textbook could prepare them for. When the first groups landed on Pacific Islands, soldiers stared in disbelief. Female nurses, dressed in khaki and fatigue shirts, stepping through the mud under a tropical sun. They became known as Angels of Bataan, Angels of Leyte, and later, Angels of Okinawa. But the halo was deceptive. Their days were filled with screams, blood, and the smell of death that clung to their clothes, no matter how often they washed them. Their mission was clear: treat the wounded, no matter who they were. The Geneva Convention demanded it. Humanity demanded it. At Guadalcanal, the first documented cases of American nurses treating Japanese prisoners emerged. Some of the captives were severely burned or emaciated, having hidden in caves for weeks before surrendering. The nurses did what they were trained to do. They cleaned wounds, administered plasma, and fed them by hand. It was not an easy decision. Many of these women had seen what the Japanese army had done to Allied nurses in the Philippines: the Bataan Death March, the massacres of hospital staff, the cruelty shown to civilians. Forgiveness was not in their orders, yet healing required it in silence. Reports from field hospitals on Leyte in late 1944 described moments of shock when captured Japanese soldiers realized they were being treated before American wounded. One nurse wrote in her journal, "They looked at me as if I were an illusion. One bowed his head when I changed his bandage. He couldn't understand why I cared." To the Japanese, American compassion was incomprehensible. Their military code had taught them that mercy was weakness, that the enemy would show none. Many believed they would be executed upon capture. Instead, they found themselves on stretchers beside the very men they had fought hours earlier. For American medical teams, those moments redefined the meaning of duty. They weren't fighting a nation. They were fighting death itself. Every heartbeat saved, friend or foe, became a small rebellion against the madness of total war. By the end of 1944, the Red Cross had established full hospital units in the Philippines and Guam. Thousands of wounded from both sides passed through them. Nurses began learning fragments of Japanese words: mizu for water, itai for pain, arigato for thanks. Humanity, piece by piece, stitched itself back together through gestures and touch. Still, the closer they moved to Japan, the harder it became. Each island grew bloodier, each battle more desperate. The nurses carried not just stretchers, but the emotional weight of everything they witnessed. And as they approached Okinawa, the last and fiercest island before Japan itself, the true test of compassion was yet to come. 1. The human angle. The weight of compassion for the American nurses. Compassion was not weakness, it was a kind of defiance. In the field hospitals of Leyte and Okinawa, they confronted the physical wreckage of men who had once been enemies, and the moral wreckage of war itself. Many wrote in their diaries of the emotional confusion that came with treating Japanese soldiers. One nurse from the 10th Army Field Hospital described how she struggled to hold back tears as she cleaned a Japanese soldier's wounds. "He was so young," she wrote. "You could see it in his hands, the same as my brother's. His body was shaking, not from pain, but from fear." These moments were never easy. Compassion required courage, the kind that doesn't come from medals or orders, but from a refusal to let hatred become habit. Every bandage tied over an enemy wound was a statement. We will not lose our humanity here. At night, when the generators died and the jungle fell silent, many nurses broke down. They wept quietly, knowing they had saved lives that had moments earlier taken others. But in their exhaustion, they also understood something few on the front lines did, that mercy could wound too, leaving scars deeper than the ones they cleaned. The enemy angle. The shock of kindness. For the Japanese soldiers, the shock was almost unbearable. From childhood, they had been told Americans were monsters, heartless devils who mutilated prisoners and burned villages. Propaganda had painted surrender as worse than death. Every Japanese recruit carried the idea that capture meant humiliation, torture, or execution. But in the humid tents of American hospitals, that belief crumbled. When nurses treated their wounds, offered water, or simply covered them with a clean blanket, many prisoners trembled in confusion. Some tried to refuse help, whispering "Yamete," "stop," as if unable to believe the gesture was real. American doctors reported that Japanese POWs would often cry silently when treated, turning their faces away in shame. They were overwhelmed not by pain, but by disbelief. One interpreter in Guam recalled a wounded sergeant who bowed weakly to a nurse after she bandaged his arm. Through the interpreter, he said, "Why do you help me? I killed your men." She didn't answer. She simply said, "You're alive. That's enough." That silence, that refusal to meet hate with hate, stayed with him. Years later, when Japan rebuilt itself, former soldiers would recall those brief encounters as the first time they saw the enemy as human. The leadership angle. Orders and ethics. Behind these individual acts of mercy stood the quiet strength of leadership. High-ranking American officers understood that how their troops treated the enemy would define the moral legacy of the war. The Pacific conflict had been savage, filled with atrocities on both sides. But the U.S. military, guided by the Geneva Convention and its own moral compass, insisted that the wounded, even Japanese, must receive medical care if captured alive. Commanders such as General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., who led the 10th Army at Okinawa, made it clear, "Our conduct must remain worthy of the cause we fight for." It was not a sentimental statement. It was practical and ethical. Mercy protected discipline, and discipline protected humanity. Medical units were briefed to maintain neutrality inside their wards. Within those canvas walls, rank and nationality ended at the door. Corpsmen were reminded that a dying man, enemy or not, was their responsibility until his last breath. That discipline mattered. It prevented vengeance from consuming the wounded tents. It reminded soldiers that even amid chaos, there were rules, not just of war, but of decency. Still, not everyone agreed. Some soldiers resented seeing their nurses treat Japanese prisoners before American wounded. Tempers flared, anger simmered, but the orders stood firm. The medics obeyed, and in doing so, they upheld something larger than victory. The idea that civilization could survive even here. Through these three angles, human, enemy, and leadership, the war in the Pacific revealed something rare. Even in the darkest places, empathy refused to die. It flickered in the hands of a nurse pressing a bandage, in the trembling silence of a captured soldier, in the resolve of officers who chose principle over rage. And as the war neared its end, these fragile acts of mercy would face their ultimate test. On the blood-soaked island of Okinawa, where compassion and cruelty collided one final time. The technological angle. Medicine in the fire by 1944, war medicine had transformed from improvisation to precision. The lessons learned in North Africa and Europe were now reaching the Pacific, carried by cargo planes and hospital ships. Plasma transfusions, sulfa drugs, penicillin. Each was a weapon against death itself. But in the jungles and coral ridges, medicine was still a brutal art. Field hospitals functioned under constant strain. Operating tables were little more than folding cots. Sterile equipment was rare. Insects swarmed under gauze, and tropical rot threatened every incision. Yet, through this chaos, technology gave the medical corps one crucial advantage: speed. The creation of mobile army surgical hospitals, early versions of what later inspired MAS-H, allowed surgeons to treat wounds within hours, not days. That difference meant survival, for Americans and Japanese alike. When captured enemy soldiers arrived at these units, triage officers faced impossible choices. The rule was simple: treat whoever needed care most urgently. No flags, no sides, only priorities. Sometimes that meant a Japanese soldier was treated before a Marine. And when that happened, witnesses later said, the tent would fall into an uneasy quiet. Men would stare, some in disbelief, others in anger. But they watched. They saw their nurses choose life over hate. And in that act, something shifted. The technology made it possible. The humanity made it meaningful. The moral angle, duty beyond nation, for every nurse or medic, there came a moment of questioning. When they looked down at an enemy soldier's face, the same uniform that had haunted their nightmares, they asked themselves, why am I doing this? The answer, for many, came from the oath they had taken long before the war: to preserve life, to ease pain, to serve without prejudice. These weren't just words. They were moral anchors in a storm that tried to tear everything apart. American nurses had heard the stories from the Philippines. Colleagues captured, tortured, and starved. Some had friends who never came back. The memories burned in their minds. Yet, when confronted with wounded Japanese prisoners, they chose to act not out of forgiveness, but principle. This moral strength baffled even their own commanders. Some officers privately admitted they could not have done the same. But for the nurses, compassion wasn't a strategy. It was identity. If we stop caring, one wrote in a letter home, then the war has already won. Their quiet defiance mattered. In an environment built on destruction, these women embodied creation. The rebuilding of trust, of decency, of the idea that even enemies shared the same fragile heartbeat. And in those moments, the nurses themselves became witnesses to the truth that war tries hardest to hide: that the enemy bleeds the same. The propaganda angle, what the cameras never showed in the age of total war, information was as powerful as bullets. The US and Japan both fought not only on the battlefield, but in the hearts of their people. Posters, radio broadcasts, and newsreels painted the enemy as evil, barbaric, inhuman. Compassion didn't fit the narrative. Few photographs ever showed American nurses tending to Japanese wounded. It was considered too confusing for the public, too gentle an image for a nation that needed fury to sustain its war effort. The Office of War Information preferred images of victory, not mercy. The Japanese side censored even more. For them, surrender and capture were national shame. To admit that soldiers had been treated by Americans and had survived was to acknowledge a crack in the ideology of absolute devotion. But the truth lived quietly, hidden in diaries, Red Cross reports, and the memories of those who saw it firsthand. Long after the war, when documents were declassified and nurses began to tell their stories, historians realized how powerful those unseen moments had been. In the dark corners of tents, while the world believed only hatred existed, compassion had taken root. And when peace finally came, that compassion would help plant the seeds of something extraordinary: reconciliation. Through technology, morality, and censorship, the story of mercy in the Pacific became more than a wartime episode. It became a mirror, showing what humanity is capable of even when the world demands the opposite. But mercy, like war, always finds its breaking point. And on Okinawa, the bloodiest island of them all, those ideals would face their hardest test. April 1945. The invasion of Okinawa began under gray skies and a wall of steel. The sea around the island boiled with ships, nearly 1,500 vessels carrying the might of the 10th U.S. Army. On shore, 100,000 Japanese soldiers waited in tunnels and ridges, prepared to die rather than surrender. Between them lay one of the most tragic chapters in military history. For the Americans, Okinawa was the final stepping stone before Japan itself. For the Japanese, it was the last stand. The fighting would last 82 days, longer, bloodier, and more desperate than anyone had imagined. When the first waves of Marines and soldiers landed, they met only silence. The real battle began inland. The Japanese had dug deep into the hills, building entire cities beneath the earth. Artillery fire rolled across the island day and night. Civilians, soldiers, and medics all became targets. There was no safe ground. In the midst of this inferno, the American field hospitals began to fill. Canvas tents stretched in endless rows. Wounded men lay shoulder to shoulder. Marines with shattered limbs, Japanese soldiers with burned flesh, Okinawan civilians crying for water. The nurses and medics worked without rest, their uniforms soaked through with blood and rain. The hospitals were scenes of both horror and grace. The nurses learned to move through the noise, the roar of planes overhead, the screams of incoming shells, the pleading of men who knew they would not make it through the night. They whispered prayers while cutting away uniforms, their hands shaking as they reached for the next stretcher. And then came the moment that would echo long after the battle ended. A small group of Japanese prisoners was brought in after a night assault. They were severely wounded, one with shrapnel in his chest, another missing a leg. The triage officer made the call that stunned everyone. The worst off among them would be treated first. An American Marine, bleeding from his shoulder, looked at the nurse tending to a Japanese soldier beside him and muttered, "Why him first?" She didn't answer. She just pressed a blood-soaked pad to the prisoner's chest and whispered, "Because he won't last if I don't." That quiet sentence, barely audible over the thunder outside, captured the soul of every medical unit on Okinawa. In that tent, nationality dissolved. There were only the dying and those trying to save them. Many Japanese soldiers could not comprehend what was happening. When plasma was hooked into their arms, some wept uncontrollably. Others tried to refuse treatment, convinced it was a trick. A few begged for their nurses to save their comrades instead. Their world, built on the belief that Americans were demons, cracked in an instant. Outside, The war showed no mercy. Kamikaze planes slammed into ships offshore, killing thousands. Artillery shells fell near the hospitals, sometimes tearing through them. Nurses dove over patients, shielding them with their bodies. When a shell hit near the 96th Division's medical tent, 2 nurses died instantly. The survivors returned to work within minutes. Despite everything, they kept saving lives. Every man treated, American or Japanese, was a victory over the inhumanity that surrounded them. But the emotional toll was devastating. One nurse later recalled, "We couldn't tell where our tears ended and the rain began. The battle raged for weeks. Thousands poured into the wards each day. Supplies ran out. Plasma bottles were rationed. Morphine became scarce. Nurses used pieces of cloth torn from their own uniforms when bandages ran short. Still, the mercy continued. A captured Japanese medic was brought in one evening, badly burned. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, he recognized the Red Cross symbol on the nurse's sleeves. Through an interpreter, he whispered, "Same work. You and me." The nurse tending him nodded. "Same work," she said. It was perhaps the first time those words had ever been spoken between enemies on Okinawa. By May, the island had become a graveyard. Yet inside those makeshift hospitals, small acts of grace persisted. They didn't change the course of the battle, but they changed the people who witnessed them. For every nurse, corpsman, and doctor, the lesson was seared into memory. War could destroy cities, nations, and bodies, but not always the human heart. And as the battle reached its final, apocalyptic stage, when Japanese resistance collapsed and civilians poured into the hospitals by the thousands, the line between mercy and survival blurred completely. The morning of March 10, 1945, began with a low hum across the island. The battle for Luzon had turned into a storm of steel. American artillery pounded Japanese positions dug deep in the hills near Balete Pass, while engineers struggled to clear paths through the jungle mud. It was supposed to be a final thrust before the Japanese surrendered. But what unfolded that day would blur the boundaries between mercy and war itself. The field hospitals were already overflowing. The air smelled of iodine and diesel. Stretchers lined the bamboo corridors, where young nurses from Iowa, Kansas, and California worked in shifts that never truly ended. They had seen American soldiers arrive, some barely breathing, others whispering prayers. But this morning, the groaning voices that reached their tents were not American. A group of Filipino scouts had brought in several wounded Japanese soldiers, found half-buried near a stream after the fighting. Their uniforms were torn, their faces gray with shock. They expected a bullet, not help. But the nurses, trained under the Geneva spirit of humanity, did not look at the flags on their sleeves. They looked at the blood. Lieutenant Margaret Hayes, chief nurse of the 31st Field Hospital, remembered the hesitation among the orderlies. Some refused at first. How could they touch the enemy who had burned villages, who had bayoneted prisoners? But orders were clear. Every wounded man was to be treated. "A soldier is a soldier," her superior had said. "Pain has no nationality." As Hayes approached the first patient, a young Japanese private with a shattered femur, his eyes widened in disbelief. He had been taught that Americans were barbarians, that capture meant torture. Yet here, an American woman knelt beside him, speaking softly, wrapping a bandage around his leg. She offered him water from her own flask. His trembling hands hesitated, then accepted. Nearby, another nurse, Corporal Jean McAllister, adjusted a morphine dose for a Japanese officer with severe burns. He tried to resist, whispering in broken English, "No, enemy help." "No." She only smiled faintly and said, "It's all right now. You're safe." He could not understand the words, but he understood the tone. The Japanese interpreter attached to the medical unit watched in silence. He had seen both sides of the war's cruelty, but even he struggled to translate what was happening. A moment so human, It defied propaganda. Outside, a group of American soldiers stood watching. Some clenched their fists, others turned away. One of them muttered, "They didn't bandage our boys at Bataan." But then he saw the nurse's hands, steady, calm, refusing to judge. And for a fleeting second, he understood that compassion could exist even here, in the ruins of revenge. By midday, the scene inside the tent had changed. The air was quieter. The cries of agony had turned into the steady rhythm of breathing. The nurses worked in silence, their faces wet with sweat, not tears. They did not seek forgiveness, only to keep death from taking one more life. One Japanese soldier tried to sit up, gesturing toward his bandaged arm. He looked around, searching for something, perhaps his weapon, perhaps an explanation. When he finally met Hayes's eyes, he bowed his head slightly. She nodded in return, then moved to the next patient. Outside, the sky darkened with the coming rain. A supply truck arrived, its tires slicing through the mud. The new stretcher cases were American again, pulled from the nearby ridge. The nurses turned without pause, shifting from enemy to ally in a heartbeat. The rhythm of compassion did not discriminate. That night, as the rain poured, the nurses gathered for a moment under the canvas roof. Their faces were pale in the lantern light. No one spoke about what they had done that day. They didn't have to. Each of them carried the same quiet thought, that the line between good and evil, between us and them, was thinner than anyone had imagined. At dawn, the Japanese prisoners who survived were moved to an improvised POW camp nearby. They looked back at the tent where they had been treated. Some bowed, some simply stared. One young soldier murmured a single word in Japanese, "Arigato." The guards didn't understand, but Hayes did. She had heard it enough times during her service in the Pacific. It meant, "Thank you." For the first time, the American nurses realized that their small act of mercy had spread through whispers among the Japanese. Within days, more surrendering soldiers approached the lines holding makeshift white flags, clutching their wounds instead of their rifles. The war wasn't over yet, but something profound had shifted. The idea that mercy could exist in the midst of destruction, this shook the Japanese more than the shells or bombs ever could. The nurses didn't know it, but their quiet defiance of hatred that day would echo in military hospitals from Manila to Tokyo after the war. It became a story whispered in both armies, a story of humanity in the face of horror. And as the field hospital prepared for another day of casualties, the sound of distant gunfire blended with the soft rustle of rain. The war went on, but so did compassion. The following days brought a strange calm to the Luzon front. After months of relentless fighting, the American advance had stalled at the mountain ridges. The Japanese, cut off from supplies and surrounded, were fighting a losing battle. Yet in the nearby valleys, a quieter conflict was taking place, a battle of conscience and survival. Word spread quickly among captured Japanese units that the Americans were not killing prisoners. Even more unbelievable, that their wounded were being treated by American nurses, women in white tending to the very men who had once sworn to die rather than be captured. It sounded like an impossible rumor, a trick. But then, a few survivors returned from the field hospital, alive and breathing, with clean bandages instead of bullet holes. By the end of March 1945, a small group of Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle, waving torn white flags made from their undershirts. They were starving, dehydrated, barely able to walk. Behind them, the jungle burned. Ahead, the Americans waited, rifles raised, unsure whether to trust what they saw. When they reached the lines, the medics stepped forward. The same nurses who had treated their enemies before now prepared stretchers again. The Japanese men looked confused, as if every step brought them closer to something unreal. One fell to his knees, repeating the word sensei, nurse, arigato. Lieutenant Hayes stood silently, watching. Her uniform was soaked with rain, her face lined from exhaustion. She had long stopped counting how many lives she had touched, American or Japanese. To her, they all looked the same when they bled. Inside the medical tent, the atmosphere had changed. Even the American soldiers who once protested now worked beside the nurses. A sergeant from Ohio, who had lost 2 friends at Bataan, helped lift a wounded Japanese officer onto the table. His hands trembled, but he didn't pull away. "Let's just get this done," he muttered. Later that evening, the field doctor received a radio call from headquarters. Reports of their treatment of enemy wounded had reached higher command. Some officers were uneasy. It was war, not charity, they argued. Others defended the nurses' actions as a reflection of American values. In the end, the decision was clear. The wounded, any wounded, were to be treated under the laws of war. Outside, the battle raged on. The Japanese 14th Area Army was collapsing, its supply lines shredded, its morale shattered. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, once called the Tiger of Malaya, was now fighting a hopeless defensive war in the mountains. His soldiers, once ready to die for the emperor, were now surrendering in small groups. And behind that shift was not just military defeat, it was psychological. They had seen mercy from an enemy they were told knew none. At one outpost near Baguio, an American patrol stumbled upon a Japanese field surgeon. He had stayed behind with his wounded, refusing to abandon them. When captured, he asked one question through the interpreter. "Your nurses? Why do they help us?" The translator hesitated, then replied simply, "Because they are nurses." The surgeon bowed his head. "Then they are stronger than any army." By April 1945, the field hospital at Luzon had become a symbol among the troops. The nurses who had once been overlooked now embodied something far greater than courage. They represented the quiet strength of compassion in a world consumed by vengeance. Newspapers back home began to hear whispers of their work, though few knew the full story. But the nurses themselves didn't seek recognition. They were too busy fighting their own war against infection, exhaustion, and despair. They cleaned wounds, wrote letters for the dying, and bandaged men who would never see peace. And in between, they treated the enemy's wounded, one by one, with the same steady hands. The Japanese prisoners, once fearful, began to volunteer small gestures of gratitude. Some tried to help sweep the tents, others folded blankets. One man, a former medic, quietly assisted in tending to other wounded Japanese soldiers. The nurses accepted the help, no questions asked. In those brief, wordless exchanges, the hatred of years began to fade, slowly but undeniably. As the final battles of Luzon drew to a close, the nurses faced their hardest test yet. A massive artillery strike hit near the field hospital, collapsing parts of the bamboo shelter. Amid the chaos, one tent caught fire. Several nurses ran toward it, ignoring shouts to take cover. Inside, they found both American and Japanese patients trapped together. Without hesitation, they dragged them out, enemy and ally alike, into the open rain. When the fire finally died, one nurse sat in the mud, her hands burned, staring at the 2 men she had saved, one wearing the stars and stripes, the other the rising sun. Both unconscious, both alive. She whispered, "That's enough." The next morning, the camp was silent. The rain had stopped. In the distance, the sound of artillery grew faint. The war was moving north. Lieutenant Hayes stood beside the rows of stretchers, the smell of antiseptic heavy in the air. She looked out toward the horizon, toward the mountains still holding out, and felt the weight of everything she'd witnessed. They had fought to heal, not to destroy, and perhaps, in doing so, they had won something greater than victory. Because even as the guns still thundered, something inside both armies had changed. The Japanese soldiers no longer feared their captors as monsters. The Americans no longer saw every enemy as inhuman. And somewhere between those two truths, the faint shape of peace began to form. The climax of the war on Luzon wasn't only the collapse of the Japanese lines, it was this moment of fragile understanding. And when the final shot was fired weeks later, it wasn't just the sound of victory. It was the echo of mercy that had already begun to heal the wounds of both nations. By late summer 1945, the guns finally fell silent over Luzon. The American flag waved above Manila once again, and the remnants of the Japanese 14th Area Army laid down their weapons. The war that had consumed the Pacific for nearly 4 years had ended in surrender, smoke, and silence. But in the makeshift hospitals scattered across the Philippines, the real reckoning had only begun. The war's aftermath did not come with cheers. It came with stretchers, with the slow, steady work of men and women who had held the line not with rifles, but with gauze, morphine, and courage. For the American nurses stationed in the Pacific, victory felt hollow. They had survived battles that blurred the meaning of good and evil. When news reached them of Japan's surrender on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, there was no celebration in the wards. Lieutenant Margaret Hayes simply looked around the tent filled with bandaged men, some American, some Japanese, and whispered, "So it's finally over." One of her assistants replied quietly, "Maybe for them, not for us." Hundreds of Japanese prisoners remained under American medical care in Luzon and Mindoro. Some were amputees, others burned beyond recognition. Yet none were abandoned. The U.S. Army Medical Corps ordered continued treatment of all wounded, regardless of nationality. It was an extraordinary command, one that reflected the slow return of moral balance after years of savagery. The nurses continued their work. They sent letters to the families of Japanese soldiers who had died under their care, notifying them through the Red Cross. Many of those letters would never reach Japan. Still, the act itself mattered. It was their way of giving dignity back to the fallen. Reports of these actions began to circulate through official Army channels. A field report dated October 1945 described the 31st Field Hospital as a unit of exceptional discipline and humanity under extreme conditions. Another noted that the treatment of enemy wounded by American medical staff has been consistent with the highest traditions of military medicine. But not everyone understood. In some American camps, there were soldiers who couldn't forgive. They saw the bandaged faces of their enemies and remembered Bataan, Nanking, or Pearl Harbor. Some muttered that mercy was wasted. Yet others, those who had seen what hate did to men, found peace in knowing that their side had not lost its soul. For the Japanese prisoners, the shock of survival slowly turned to reflection. They had entered the war believing capture was dishonor worse than death. Yet here they were, fed, cleaned, treated by the very enemy they were told to despise. One former corporal, interviewed years later by Japanese historians, said quietly, "The first time an American nurse touched my hand, I realized everything I had been taught was a lie." By early 1946, many of these nurses returned home. Some carried scars, others memories that never left them. Margaret Hayes was among them. She disembarked in San Francisco, wearing the same weather-beaten uniform she had worn in Luzon. Reporters greeted her with cameras, asking how it felt to heal the enemy. She gave a simple answer. They were all human. That was enough. Behind her words lay the quiet truth of what they had achieved. In the midst of one of history's most brutal wars, they had proven that mercy could coexist with duty. That compassion did not weaken an army, it strengthened its humanity. In Japan, after the surrender, American nurses continued to serve as part of the Allied occupation forces. They worked in Tokyo, Yokohama, and Okinawa, treating civilians who had suffered under years of bombing and famine. Many of the same women who had once patched up Japanese prisoners in Luzon now tended to Japanese children starving in the ruins of their cities. Slowly, these acts began to change perceptions on both sides. Japanese civilians saw that not every American came with a weapon. American soldiers saw that their compassion could rebuild what war had destroyed. And so, the story of the field nurses of Luzon became more than just a wartime memory. It became an early chapter in reconciliation, a quiet, unrecorded step toward peace long before treaties were signed. The war was over. The wounds would take generations to heal. But inside those canvas tents, far from the cameras and headlines, the healing had already begun. And yet, for many who served there, the hardest part wasn't over. Because when the soldiers went home, the nurses carried something invisible. The faces of those they had saved. And those they couldn't. In the years that followed Japan's surrender, the world struggled to make sense of what it had just lived through. Trials were held, alliances redrawn, nations rebuilt from ash. But far from the courtrooms of Tokyo and Nuremberg, the quieter heroes of the war, the field nurses and medics, returned to ordinary lives, carrying memories history books rarely mention. For the American nurses who had served in Luzon and across the Pacific, their story did not end with the final gunshot. Many were invited to medical conferences and veterans gatherings to speak about their wartime experiences. When asked about bravery, they never mentioned bombs or bayonets. They spoke instead about the moment they knelt beside a wounded Japanese soldier and chose to help him live. In 1947, the U.S. Army Nursing Corps released a short report titled Mercy Under Fire. It documented the humanitarian efforts of nurses during combat operations. Buried in its pages was a small section about the Luzon campaign. Instances were observed where American nurses rendered medical care to enemy personnel under extreme conditions, demonstrating moral integrity beyond the call of duty. It was brief but powerful, a quiet acknowledgement of something rare in total war. A few years later, during the Allied occupation of Japan, some of those same nurses found themselves stationed in the very country they once fought against. Tokyo was a wasteland of charred ruins and fragile hope. The people were broken, hungry, and frightened. But when American nurses entered the makeshift clinics, they were greeted not with hate, but with bowed heads and silent gratitude. Japanese civilians called them white angels. Mothers brought sick children to them with tears in their eyes. Old men who had fought in the Imperial Army would nod respectfully as they passed. The act of compassion shown during the war had taken root. Word had spread through whispered stories, from prisoners who had survived Luzon and returned home after the surrender. One such story belonged to Sergeant Kenji Mori, a former Japanese infantryman captured in 1945. After recovering in an American field hospital, he returned to Japan and became a teacher. In his memoir, published decades later, he wrote, "When I was wounded, I believed death would be my honor. But the Americans treated me as a man, not an enemy. I decided from that day to teach my students that kindness is stronger than fear." His account was read widely in post-war Japan, becoming part of a growing movement to humanize the enemy and reject the militarism that had led them into disaster. The simple kindness of American nurses had done what propaganda and occupation policies could not. It touched hearts. Meanwhile, in the United States, those same nurses blended back into civilian life. Some married, some continued their medical careers, others became teachers. But for all of them, the war left a permanent mark. Margaret Hayes, now in her late 30s, taught at a nursing school in Chicago. In her lectures, she often reminded her students, "Compassion is your greatest weapon. It's the only thing that can't be destroyed by war." Recognition came slowly. It wasn't until the 1960s, during the growing interest in oral histories, that military archivists began interviewing surviving members of the Pacific Nursing Corps. Their testimonies were calm, factual, and profoundly moving. They described how they had cleaned wounds under fire, how they had written names in notebooks for soldiers who could no longer speak, and how they had learned that mercy was not weakness. It was defiance. The Japanese government, too began to honor these acts indirectly. In 1975, during a goodwill event marking 30 years since the end of World War II, Japan's Minister of Health mentioned the courage and humanity of Allied medical workers who had treated Japanese wounded. It was a brief line in a long speech, but those who understood history recognized it as a quiet tribute. As decades passed, the story of the American nurses who bandaged their enemies' wounds slowly faded from public memory, overshadowed by the grand narratives of battles and generals. Yet among historians, their legacy endured. Military ethics courses at West Point and in Japanese medical universities began dates referencing their actions as examples of the highest standards of humanitarian conduct in war. Their compassion did not rewrite history, but it softened its edges. It reminded both nations that even in humanity's darkest hours, light could still exist, not from victory, but from mercy. By the time the last of those nurses passed away, most had never considered themselves heroes. They had simply done what they believed was right, but their quiet defiance against hatred had rippled across oceans and generations, and though the war had ended long ago, the lesson remained timeless, that the measure of any civilization is not how fiercely it fights, but how deeply it remembers its humanity when everything around it demands otherwise. History often remembers the roar of guns, not the whisper of mercy. It celebrates the generals, not the hands that stopped the bleeding. Yet somewhere in the mud of Luzon, in the humid silence after a battle, a handful of nurses showed the world that compassion could exist even in the heart of destruction. Their story was not one of victory or defeat. It was about the quiet strength that survives when both have lost their meaning. When those American nurses reached across the line of hate and dressed the wounds of Japanese soldiers, they did more than save lives. They proved that humanity itself could endure war. War strips away illusions. It shows what men and women truly are when everything else is gone. The nurses of Luzon stood amid that truth and chose kindness. No orders, no medals, no cameras. Just the belief that suffering should never be measured by the color of a uniform. In the years that followed, their simple act of mercy echoed far beyond the Philippines. It shaped how nations treated prisoners, how soldiers saw their enemies, and how medicine in war was understood, not as a weapon, but as a promise. Even today, in humanitarian missions and combat zones across the world, their spirit endures in the oath every medic takes, to heal without judgment, to protect life above all else. When historians look back on the Pacific War, they see dates, divisions, and destruction, but beneath all of it lies this small, unrecorded miracle, a moment when compassion defied vengeance. Because in the end, the true victory of that war was not written in Tokyo Bay or etched on any monument. It lived quietly in a canvas tent under tropical rain, where American nurses bandaged their enemies first. And for that brief, fleeting moment, humanity won.